You can't have your cake and eat it too. It's a classic saying, but maybe it doesn't ring true in the investment world. Today, I'm joined by Arian from PropX Invest to talk about a particular short-term rental deal and how it could really stack up to be a fruitful investment, especially looking over the longer term.
In terms of the client brief as well, looking for a first-time investor, first-time property buyer under 700,000, you have to look at a lot of different pockets that are quite affordable. And the hill, when it comes to the apartment market, is. And when we're picking apartments, it's really important to make sure that you're buying in areas where the growth is quite strong. So we look at the hill because this suburb is really rich historically with its charm and really great views. Because it's set on a hillside, it does give you those beautiful outlooks over to the coastline and also the city. And it's also in close proximity to obviously Newcastle CBD, but also walking distance to the beach and the coastline. So you can go for nice walks.
Pretty unique little suburb there in Newcastle. Like, it's just tucked away, super central. When you look at like the land supply, there's not a lot of land. There isn't any land left in that area, and that's sort of something that ticks my boxes, I know.
Oh no, absolutely. There's scarcity in the land there, right? And it's a smaller suburb as well on the coastline for Newcastle, so it's really scarce in the land. And people are building up, right? Obviously, you're not seeing any more houses and things like that. So the other important thing is with the hill, because it's got that mix of modern but also older character properties, you're able to buy those apartments in those red brick buildings that are sort of boutique complexes, right? Less than 10, less than 8. And the example we'll go with today is around, I think you had 8 units in the entire complex, which is obviously scarcity in the land itself.
So have you got any data you can share with us today, Aaron, just on a bit of a track record for the suburb? And I know history is not always the perfect indicator of the future, but certainly it helps as a bit of a guide.
Now, this is just one of the tools that we use at PropX. As you know, Sean, real estate data is quite dirty. Depending on the source you use, one says one thing, another says another. So we're just showing this one here. However, on average, depending on the data source, over the last 10 years, you're seeing anywhere between 5 to 7% growth per annum, which you can see also here with the numbers outlined. But what I love about the hill is that it hasn't really gone down. There's never been any negative trends. It's always been positive. Now, in terms of positive, has it been growing at 1% per annum, 2%, 3%, or has it been growing at 5, 7% per annum? So it obviously, as any market cycle, in a real estate market, it goes through cycles, but it's always been trending upwards, as you can see from this linear line going positive. When we talk about the property in further detail and maybe the potential capital growth you can get and really deep dive into the data, you'll see like, wow, this might be a juicy little deal if you're able to hold it long term. And that's why I like the hill as well. It's not a quick play or a quick turnaround, especially if you're buying a unit. You're buying for the long term. You want to hold it for 10 to 20 years, but again, you want to make sure it doesn't bleed your pocket dry. And
Absolutely.
that's why I came to you and the team and talk about the short-term rental approach and how you can be neutral or positively geared from the onset, basically.
And I think that's a good little segue there to actually bring up the property itself.
Yeah.
So the property we're looking at is a property that recently sold in the area, and I think it's just a perfect candidate for deal or no deal. So the property we're looking at is Unit 6 at 3 Moresbury Crescent, The Hill. It's freshly renovated property. It's basically turnkey. You could come in here, no work needs to be done. And to speak to Arian's point, it's also in a very small complex. There's only a number of units in that complex, which becomes really desirable. It means that, if repairs need to happen, it's not happening at like these extremes where it's costing $2-3 million to paint the complex. It's very cheap and affordable to keep these red brick properties well maintained. So this property sold just recently, 11th of October, for $650. And this is what we're really going to deep dive into. So to look at like this particular deal and analyze it from like a short-term rentals perspective, we use a tool called Price Labs, but you can also do this just by jumping onto Airbnb and having a look around at comparable properties. So using Price Labs, essentially we arrived at an average daily rate of $246 for this property with an 82% occupancy. And the properties that we based this on were basically these 3 very comparable properties. So this one here, red brick property, similar location. To me, this one hasn't really been presented well. They've used pretty average photos, and that's definitely going to have a negative impact on returns. This property here's been photographed a bit better, but like, it's a beaches suburb. You want it to have that beaches vibe, and I think they've just sort of missed the mark there with the furnishings on that one. And then this third property is probably the nicest of the bunch. It's been well photographed, well presented. It's certainly a property that would book well. But this is where this tool basically does base its returns on those properties. And that does allow room for improvement. So if we know and we come in and we do a better job setting up this property than those three, then we could actually expect returns in excess of like this 73,000 that this program spat out based on those three properties. So to jump into the actual earnings on this property, we can then start to look at things like what are the Airbnb management fees? What could you expect to pay a property manager to look after this property so it is passive for you?
Quickly as well, before we jump into it, how important is it to photograph the property to make sure you have the right manager and the right copy? Because how can that impact the pricing, right? You mentioned before those listings weren't really optimal. What does that difference make?
I feel like the short-term rental markets, where the long-term rental market was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and where the sales market was 10 years ago. So if we look at like the long-term rental market, the good real estate agencies are now using professional photos, where 3 or 4 years ago they weren't. And then if we look at like the sales market, you go back 10 years ago and it was maybe 50% of agents using professional photos. So where the short-term market currently sits is where on that crust where the good managers are using professional photos, really making the most and generating a lot of extra income on the back of that. But there's still a lot of, you want to use the word cowboys, but maybe I shouldn't. Just taking photos on their phone and presenting a really poor product to the market. And that also creates an opportunity at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, let me share my screen so we can go into sort of the numbers in a bit more detail. Sean, you can walk us through sort of what you would say from the revenue calculator.
Yeah, so this is basically spat out and given us an idea of what it would actually look like to have this property on the short-term market. And it definitely highlights the difference between like a gross income, which the short-term market always has an exceptional gross income, but then it like plateaus down to the net. So for this particular property, the gross income is sitting around that 73,000 mark, but there is a number of higher outgoing attributions for this when you consider this versus the long term. And that mainly sits at management fees, platform fees, which is like your Airbnb, booking.com, but then also in your electricity and your internet coverage. So that's typically not provided in a long-term rental. So that does eat into those high gross returns. But for this one, once it's all said and done, once you're factoring in your strata, your water, your council rates, those additional outgoings of the short-term market, the property still sits as a positive cash flow property. That's including your interest payments as well on the loan. So for this particular property, it's going to wash its own face. It's going to sit somewhere around $1,000 a year positive, which if by the time you include depreciation schedules in that, it could actually be a slightly more positive than that. But at least, as I said earlier, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the investment property without it actually chewing a massive hole in your pocket each week. To look at it on like the long-term rental market, I guess it just sort of starts to paint a picture of sort of how some properties do perform exceptionally well in the short-term market, where this property on the long-term market, have we got some numbers around that, Aaron?
Yeah, of course. So let me quickly share my screen here. So this is the STR. Again, we're talking about the short-term rental. The revenue post fee is about $1,099. Now, if you look at the long-term rental comparison, obviously taking out, internet, water usage, things like that, which you're not going to pay for, you can see that post fees, you actually minus $15,807 a year. So that's a negative 2.4% yield, and the gross yield is only 4.4%.
That's a big difference, 18 grand a year difference between the short term and the long term market. And that's looking at this property at a $550 a week rental.
Yeah, and that's what it's currently rented for. So now $1,099 might not seem like a lot of money per year to get, right? And that is completely understandable. However, when it comes to property, we want to aim for that capital growth as well, which is when I was talking about the hill and the location, and we saw on the data, it's grown around 7% per annum on this one tool that I shared. Now, let's be a little bit more conservative and say it's grown maybe 5% per annum. You're probably going to be looking at about $409,000 growth over 10 years.
Yeah, that really starts to stack up when you factor in the capital growth.
Oh, absolutely.
What I guess makes property investing so attractive is that capital growth over that longer time period.
Absolutely, because if you even just obviously say that's 409,000 over 10 years, you're looking at about, $41,000 a year, right? Which is absolutely insane for a unit anyway. Obviously, look, there's units in, Cremorne or Bondi and things like that grow massively. But you're talking about in Newcastle, in an affordable market where a first-time home buyer can get that.
And that's, I think, the big point is the affordability. Like, we're not talking a $2 million apartment or a $3 million house. this was a $650,000 deal. So, for the cost of a Ford Ranger, someone can get into this. Like for 80, 90K, you could have your 10% deposit, cover your stamps, furnish the property, and get into this deal for under six figures, which, anyone starting out, that's gotta be appealing.
No, absolutely. And the biggest thing as well is like the capital growth. You can't, understate that. Yes, $1,000 extra a year is great. It's positive. It's not impacting your lifestyle, which is the biggest thing as well. And plus, you can use the apartment yourself. Got a nice little holiday in Newcastle if you wanted to, right?
Have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, have your cake and eat it too, and you get that capital growth.
Looking at that capital growth within 2, 3, 4 years, you could have enough equity just in that one property to recycle that equity and go again and buy your second or your third property, depending on what number it is for you.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, it depends on the cycle as well, right? It depends on where you're buying this property, where it is in the cycle. Like if it's in an upwards trajectory, yeah, in 2, 3 years' time, you can probably see 80 to 120K capital growth for a unit. And that's an affordable first home buyer markets. That's just you right now. Yeah.
And I think, we're analysing this deal. I think we were looking at 6.5% interest rates. You look on the horizon, and the reality is they're going to come down, those interest rates. So, you could fast forward 2, 3 years into the future, and maybe the interest rates are at 4.5%. And that extra 2%, that's like a saving of 10, 15 grand per year, which makes a huge difference on a deal like this.
Absolutely. And that also opens up your serviceability, right? Because obviously then you're able to service maybe an additional loan, whereas at a 6.5% interest rate, you couldn't. But if the interest rate drops, your equity is strong, the cash flow of this property is positive, then you're able to then buy another property while holding this one, which is a really crucial thing.
So I guess that leads to the ultimate question. So is it a deal or no deal, Arian?
I want to have my cake and eat it too. So I'd say it's a good deal.
Love it, mate. Love it. Look, cheers for your time. Looking forward to catching up and doing it again soon.
Yeah, appreciate it, Sean.